Hello, party people, or just people that are bored enough to listen to our podcast. This is part 2 of the Everything Store, the story of Jeff Bezos founding Amazon. If you've not listened to part 1, I would suggest you stop here and go back and start with part 1. But if you're crazy, go ahead and keep listening. If you're new, please subscribe. And if you love our show, please share it with your friends.
You're listening to Let Me Speak to a Manager with Frank Cava and Ian Matthews.
What a crock of shit.
Yeah, that was hot mic, Sam.
It's 30 minutes away. I'll be there in 10.
Do it live! I'll write it and we'll do it live!
So, totally different topic. So, pictured Amazon in the late 90s. Barnes & Noble is a monster. They're as big as Home Depot at the time. They're still a large company, but at the time they were the company if you were in the book game. And Barnes & Noble was founded and still run by the Riccios at the time. And Riccios, they invited Bezos out to dinner. And the way this dinner went down, they were very polite. And Amazon wasn't turning a profit, and they were kind of hinting around maybe doing some kind of a joint venture or an acquisition of Amazon. But in no uncertain terms, they said, we're launching a Barnes & Noble website, and we're going to crush you. We're just going to destroy you. You know we're bigger. We have the brand. You don't. We're going to smoke you. And Bezos kind of took all this in stride. No, picture, though, again, they're losing money. Amazon is losing money. They're not making any money. They're not the dynamo they were. Barnes & Noble was the monster. But Bezos kind of smiled and said, okay, no thanks. And his quote is, disruptive small companies will triumph over big companies because they're too stuck in their way. He didn't think Barnes & Noble could pivot and create a website because everything in their company was built around distribution and large retailers. And he was right. They did launch a website and they tried to price as low as they could, but they just couldn't make an internet company work within. It became its own silo. There was infighting over talent. They just couldn't make it work. And everything Bezos predicted, the big companies just can't compete with a smaller disruptive one, was 100% accurate. I just look at that story and I think, God, the stones he had to turn down a big check from a very powerful family and company and brand, just takes some outrageous belief in yourself.
I go back to calluses. He built the callus when he left New York. He built the callus when he left a cushy job. I built the callus when I left NVR. I was living in an 8,000 square foot house. I had everything I could possibly want, but I was perfectly miserable in my career. And I walked away from it and I said, no. It's the same reason I took chips off the table instead of, we make fun of me for driving a crappy car. I drove a crappy car followed by another crappy car for the better part of 2 decades because they were paid for and it didn't cost anything. It's just little things like this. I'll say this, we can move on to the next one with the Barnes & Noble story. If you're going to build anything of note, you need to have belief. I've talked about it multiple times. When you have someone in front of you, like Barnes & Noble, and they are offering you something, you use the term stones. You have to have incredible self-belief, and you have to have a mission and a purpose that is so different than how most people are wired, or you're going to cash out early. It's just how it's going to happen. But you've got to believe that. And there are sacrifices that you just need to make. One of my friends started he's an investment banker. And I remember he was living really, really low key to help buy this steel mill that ultimately got bought by US Steel, who's the company that Carnegie founded, JP Morgan bought. Mm-hmm. It just came out in the Wall Street Journal maybe 45, 60 days ago. They got bought for $900 million. and then they got a second installment of just under $1 billion. So they were bought for almost $2 billion by a blue blood American company. And I watched this guy like literally not eat before he came and met us at bars because he was just scrimping and living on so little so he could eventually get there. So like there's the belief side of it, and there's the sacrifice you have to make to do it. The other thing that is in this that I want to unpack very fast is disruptive and small companies can triumph over big companies stuck in their ways. At the mastermind, what I see is usually people are good at generating leads one way. So if you're a good PPC lead generator, you're usually not good with mail, and vice versa. You're going to go extinct unless you master multiple skills. If you can't get a lead to convert more than one way, someone else is going to figure that out. If you are the Barnes and Noble in your market and with your product and with what you do, and you just do one thing, someone else is going to figure out how to get your lead because you are stuck in your ways. You're not innovating, and you must. And what I do is not nearly as complicated as what Amazon does, but this fundamental is 100% true. The biggest people in our space don't innovate. They're not creative. They don't do it well. And little people like us can take their market share because of it.
Look at what Quicken has done in mortgage.
Right.
I was right in the mortgage game. I mean, Quicken came out, they invested like crazy in technology. Everyone said, well, you can't do a mortgage fast. You can't give a loan approval same day. You can't do applications on an app. There's just too many disclosures. They just blew all of it apart, and they did it, and they destroyed everyone. And you're silly if you don't look at Quicken, because their cost basis is so much lower than everyone else's because of technology that they can give you a great rate. And yes, they will give you an approval faster than every other mortgage company, and they probably will close on time. They still have issues like anyone else with talent, other things they go into, but for the most part, Quicken made everything easier and faster on the front end. And most mortgage companies were just kept printing out packages and sitting down in front of people who didn't want to do that. So there are multiple people in this book that are incredibly important to Amazon's formation, that the company outgrows their skill set. So a little bit of Peter Principle. There's a guy by the name of Shel Caffin, who is an original partner with Amazon. He was in the garage with Jeff when they were working on doors that were put on for tables. And he built out a lot of the technology infrastructure and the original website for Amazon. And Bezos, at different times, has said he's the most important person in the history of Amazon. There is no Amazon without him. But once Amazon got big enough, Jeff kind of took away his authority. Just slowly started moving him into, would convince him to take kind of these advisory roles within the corporation. He had no direct reports, influence roles, dotted line roles, and it hurt Shel. It hurt him a lot. And when he quit, Bezos didn't try to keep him. And even though Jeff flew him out to Hawaii with, the whole S team and all of their wives, and they had this big Shel party, retirement party. They were friends, and Shel was very, very hurt. He called it one of the biggest disappointments in my entire life, the way his career ended at Amazon. And over in this book, every 3 to 5 years, Jeff is switching out his S team because the company is outgrowing the talents of the people that report directly to Jeff. And I think that's how it works in a growing company. Is the bigger it gets, the more complex it gets. You have to find different talent that can evolve, that can take it to another level. And the people that you start with, the people that are with you early, aren't necessarily the ones that can help you get to the next level.
It's so funny because when I was a little kid, I used to watch athletes, and I used to think like Mike Tyson in the 90s could be Mike Tyson in the 80s. And I was a fan. I was a little boy. I didn't know. But Mother Nature caught up to him, and he couldn't be that guy again. Michael Jordan on the Wizards was not Michael Jordan in his rookie season for the Bulls.
Yeah.
He was a lot older. It happens in every facet of life. And what you start to realize is that life is a pretty unforgiving thing. It is. In my business, I've been in business since 2009, 11, 12 years later. Our longest standing employee has been with us for roughly 5 years. We're better now. I can pay more now. Our benefits are better. The talent we can attract is better. And it's not that those weren't nice people. They didn't have the skill set that I need now. There's an entire thing in here about Shell and in this book about what he built. And it was a web system that worked really well for a small company whenever they sold something, a bell would go off. But for the company that we all know now, it was antiquated. And I wrote down Paul Seville's name because he's the CEO of NVR that Ian knows better than me, but we both know him very well. And he was kind of this way, been being ruthless. But a better example is your first boss, Jack Welch. Like, ruthless. GE was a 100-year-old business by the time you got there, and they were ruthless. They were always getting rid of the bottom 10 or the bottom 20%. And
Netflix today, Netflix has that same approach. That Netflix has a test. They do it every year. Their HR department is in on it. But the CEO asks himself, if I was interviewing this person today for this job's challenges, would I hire them again?
Right.
And if the answer is no, then they go. And Netflix pays so high. They purposely pay above market, Netflix, to attract better talent all the time. But what they believe is by paying above market, it forces them to put the best person in the job. You have to go because you're making so much. If you can't keep up and do what you're supposed to, you got to go. And I got to tell you, Frank, I think this is a very big differentiator in companies that grow and don't grow, is the ones with leaders that have the guts to say, you know what, I love you. You're not the right person for this job anymore. And you got to go. And are willing to come in and replace old friends that just aren't the same as they used to be. If you want to grow, you have to be able to replace people that you like, but they just aren't right for the job.
And I think what's really important to distinguish here or differentiate, we've talked a lot about innovation in this podcast. Amazon innovates. As an employee, you must also innovate. Your skills must grow. If you become stagnant, you will get replaced because of the fact that the company is going to grow. No business can do the exact same thing repetitively without innovation, without going extinct. So as a business owner, you have to understand the people who are working with me must evolve or they need to go. And so it comes from both sides. So I'll relay this story and then we can move on to something else. But I have a sister and she's incredible. You know her, she's incredible. And she's kind of happy-go-lucky. And my wife will tell me like how incredible my sister is. And she's incredible. You can say nothing other than she's incredible. But what I tell her is I used to be happy-go-lucky like that too. And my wife is like, no. I'm like, no. In my 20s, I was very similar to my sister. But the business world has hardened me. And it's hardened me because I realize it's survival of the fittest. And when I had to fire 25 people in one day in August in 2006, I realized like as shitty of a day as that was for me, it was a way worse day for those other people. But if I didn't do that, they'd be coming for me. And that's a reality. We live in a capitalistic society. That's it. So if you aren't always looking forward and always helping to grow and always innovating, you're going to go the way of the dinosaur. And for me, it's the same for me. Like I know as an innovator, someone is going to replace me. So it's
as Sally found out in The Godfather, there is no old time's sake.
That's right.
You add value. Paul Seville, you brought him up. one of his favorite sayings, and he didn't say it in front of the masses, but he would say, on the 15th of the month, we all get even every month. And what he meant is there is no sentiment. There is no what about the last 10 years. It is, are you the right person for the job today? I'm paying you to do a job. You're doing it well. Great. But we get even once a month because at NVR, you're only paid once a month, which is an NVR thing. Funny story here, and we can just touch this one quick. Bezos went to Harvard Business School in 1997, and he presented his business to a bunch of, kids who thought they were hotshots. And one of the kids in the audience, pretty much the entire class was unanimous that Amazon should get out. They're going to get crushed in the wave of retailers coming online. And one kid said, Jeff, you seem like a really nice guy, so don't take this the wrong way, but you should sell to Barnes and Noble and get out now. And Bezos kept his cool. He's listening to a bunch of punk, spoiled, entitled Harvard kids. And he said, you might be right, but I think you're underestimating the degree to which established brick and mortar businesses might be so used to doing things a certain way, they'll find it hard to be nimble and focus attention on a new channel. And that was 1997. And he completely predicted the future. Big companies just did not handle switching over to the internet well at all. And the one thing I take away from here is if I were in that audience in 1997, I'd have been one of those entitled little shits saying you're not going to make it. Because when you're a young kid and you're in college, you think you know everything. And until you put your own money into something, you really don't know anything. Everyone is brave. Everyone has an opinion when they're a salaried employee. When you go put your own money into something, that's when you earn some respect in the business world. And anyone who doesn't own equity in something, they all have a million ideas. Go own it and then tell me what your ideas are. Because until you do, you're just chirping.
The richest people in the world haven't gone to B school. The richest people in the world have a bunch of kids that went to B school that work for them. I'll say two things. One, we had all the exact same stuff underlined in the book. We did. I thought this was as equally as incredible as you did. And the other thing I'll say is this. In 1997, the established business was Whole Foods. The non-established business was Amazon. And Amazon bought Whole Foods. Mm-hmm. It should have gone the other way, but it didn't. Because Amazon innovated and changed and grew and went where they were going. And back then, it was unbelievable, the profit margins. Most grocers work on a 2 or 3% profit line, and Whole Foods was running like a 30% profit line. And they didn't innovate. They just kind of sat there and let everybody catch up to them. And then Publix and Kroger all put a health food aisle in that rivaled Whole Foods and sold things for less. And people who were dollar conscious shop there instead. And that's the reason why, is because the brick and mortar is the turtle and it got caught.
The, one thing that's obvious through the story arc is, Amazon tried all kinds of acquisitions and most just did terrible. I mean, Zappos is a famous one that did well. Whole Foods is another one that's done well, but they were big when they bought it.
So I think there's a line in the sand. I think there was a period where they sucked at it and it was in the beginning. And I think later they got better at it.
They got better, but there's also hundreds lately that they've not. Now they have so much money, they just throw it at all kinds of stuff. But if you really look at where their growth has come from, it's, focus is everything for the Amazon story. They just were relentlessly focused on being the everything store of you could buy whatever you want and we're going to ship it to you fast. But they lost hundreds of millions of dollars on companies like pets.com, gear.com, windshopper.com, Greenlight, homegrocer.com. I mean, they were paying tens of millions of dollars for these. The bubble burst and Bezos was like, okay, bad moves. Let's move on and get back focused on our core business. And And I think most companies that are really, truly great have a very narrow focus and they just execute the crap out of it. And they don't get themselves spread out with too many ideas.
I took this in a different direction than you. And although I agree with everything you say, I'll say this. There was 2 companies that they took over, and they took over well. And what they did is they bought out diapers.com. It was a bunch of different names, but it ultimately was diapers.com. And they bought out Zappos. And in both instances, what Amazon did is they were so freaking big, they couldn't be screwed with. And they got leverage over both companies because they had such market share. They worked at a loss to get both of these companies to succumb. They acquiesced, but they more or less succumbed. And they're like, you're right. You can bleed us. We'll do the merger now. And they got way less than they probably could have if Amazon wasn't so all-knowing. It's kind of like they became better at acquisitions when they became the Death Star.
When they had data.
Yeah, and I use the term Death Star on purpose because it's a Star Wars reference, which is good for SEO. But more than that, it's what it was. Like they had all the data, but they had the market share. They had all these other things, and they could bleed you dry because they could.
Well, you go buy Ring for $1 billion. They're already proven. They already got the sales. They got distribution channels set up. So you're taking less risk when you have the kind of money to throw around. When Google buys Nest for $3 billion,
Right.
They can see that they've sold over 1 million units in the past year. Like they have the numbers, they have the margins. They don't have, with pets.com, they were kind of taking bets. It was a little more risky. It was like parlays, versus just taking the safe bet on a football game.
There's a couple of sides of this, but I'll tell a funny story. So when Ian and I were first kind of becoming friends, one of the things that we would do is we would geek out over annual reports. And we always read the Warren Buffett letter to shareholders because it's a great letter. We would read, for years, we read the Apple report. I would flip through the Amazon report, but we would always read the Google report. And the Google annual report, Ian used this term and I loved it. Do you remember what you used to call Google?
Dominique Wilkins.
Human
highlight film.
And the reason was they had so much freaking money. They were all offense. They were no defense. Dominique Wilkins, for those of you that don't know, could dunk from the foul line, but he could do it in a way that Jordan couldn't. He did all this beautiful stuff. How many titles did Dominique Wilkins win?
Didn't win any, and he wasn't the best defensively.
That's right. And how many did Jordan win? 6, because Jordan was a defensive wizard. He worked just as hard on offense as he did on defense. But the reason Ian called them this, and I loved it, is Google was printing money because of PPC and because of what they had going on with their ad spend. They could. Amazon got to a point where they could take bigger risks. And if they lost $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion, it didn't matter. Like that matters to us mere mortals. But for a big company like that, like, have you ever seen a fine that these companies get? They're $3 billion. It's just a write-off. It just becomes a tax deduction. It changes when you get to such huge scale that you get to be just an offensive company.
So let's pivot to Bezos and what he was, what kind of a manager he was. So a couple of funny stories that I liked. He had a outrageous temper. Bezos could fly off the handle. He was a yeller, a little bit like Jobs in that. He had a fulfillment manager that he had asked in a meeting, and he was already frustrated with customer service, how long people were waiting. And this fulfillment manager bullshit him, which you just never do to a CEO. And I've learned that lesson myself many times. But he said, well, it's well under a minute. And so right in front of the whole S team, there's 20 people in this room, conference table. Bezos calls the Amazon 800 number, puts it on speaker, pulls his watch out and clicks it to make a big show of the fact that he's timing it. And everyone in the room is squirming. Everyone's freaking out. The fulfillment manager, after a couple of minutes, starts making furious phone calls to find out why no one's picking up. It took 4.5 minutes. Bezos picks someone answers and he says, just checking, and hangs up. And the book says his face grew red, the vein bulged in his forehead, and the hurricane warning system was off. And so he went off, and this guy called him a friggin' idiot. You're a moron. You're incompetent. You're dishonest. And the guy was out a few months later. But, for me, the takeaway here is if you don't have the numbers, don't bullshit. Don't ever do that to an executive. And my quick story, I was in a review with Paul Seville, and it was one of the best quarters my team had ever had. I couldn't wait to talk to him about all of my good numbers. All of my arrows were green, except for like a couple. And so typical CEO, instead of seeing all the green arrows up, he found the one that was down, found the one that was red. It was like our sale to application times. And I was pissed. I was pissed that he found like the one wart on my beautiful reports. I'd worked so hard to show all these good numbers. I wanted to brag. And he was like, well, why is your application rate down versus everyone else? And I was like, we've had some tough times with realtors, or, I made something up, something some sorry ass loan officer had said to me 2 weeks ago. And I just kind of parroted it. And he was like, really? And he goes down the list and he looks at every regional in the room who had a better application percent than me. He goes, hey, Glenn, you got realtors up in Pittsburgh? He goes, yeah, yes, Paul, we got realtors in Pittsburgh. He goes, what's the realtor percentage up there? And he's asking his analyst, and Jeff pulls it out. He goes, it's about the same as DC. And he goes, oh, it looks like you're about 10% higher than Ian. Hey, Dave, out in Cleveland, you don't have realtors? You don't have that problem that Ian's got, huh? Makes this painful way around the whole table, right? To where all the numbers say that my realtors are no higher than anyone else's. And he comes around to me and he goes, so let's talk about your realtor problem, Ian. And by now I'm grinning because I'm just pissed. I'm kind of just mad. And I'm like, clearly we have an execution issue. The next time we meet, I am not going to have an application problem. And he smiled at me and he goes, could have saved everyone a lot of time if you'd have led with that. And I just nodded my head. I was like, okay, I get it. You don't bullshit a CEO. You don't bullshit a CEO.
You ultimately quit that job, huh?
Yeah, like 11 years later.
All right, fair enough.
11 years later. I worked for him a long time and I loved him.
But so I'll tell another Paul Seville story that's funny. I don't think you're worth a damn as an owner if you don't roll your sleeves up and get in there from time to time. Like you have to.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that Seville did is he drove the models. So in Ryan Holmes parlance, what that means is he'd get in his car and he'd drive around and go through model homes.
Get on the field. Yeah.
But he lived in the DC metro market. Like you didn't hear about stories of him doing this in Charlotte. He would do it in the DC metro market. He usually do it on like a Saturday.
Virginia, Maryland. Yeah.
Yeah. And it turns out that he went to all the models with the most beautiful sales reps. So I don't know what the motivations were, but he would get out there and he would go visit the models. But this is what happened. Seville was out driving models last week. We got to make sure we're incredible just in case he shows up. And that would last for like 6 or 8 weeks. And there's a halo effect that goes into that. In my business, I'm always doing little things to check. So you know that I know what's happening.
I'm paying attention.
Yes, because it has ripples. When you show up and look at something and you find something that's wrong and you bring it to light, if your company is managed right and if the right people in the right seats, they're going to look at that and they're going to get a little bit embarrassed. They're going to get a little bit nervous. They're going to say, that isn't happening to me again. The next time he went through your report and found something on there, was it that issue or was it a different issue?
It wasn't that issue. No, that was cleaned up.
You fixed that issue because that was the one that he brought to light.
That was cleaned up.
And that's what happens. Good managers do that. Now, there's a way to do it to be a complete asshole and embarrass people. And there's also a way to do it that is a little bit more sustainable. But as a manager, sometimes you got to do a little bit of both. And sometimes there's got to be a little bit of fear from the owner down, because this is a company that is sacred, that if you don't treat it as such, it will go extinct. So
And for the
that's
record, I felt the way Paul handled it was perfect. And I thought it was great management. And he was doing it with someone who could handle it.
Yep.
Everything about it was right. I'm a highly paid senior executive making a bullshit excuse off the top of my head, and he smelled it. He didn't raise his voice, and he made a very good point to me. And that is good management. When someone tries to bullshit their way through something, you make sure the whole table knows, I smell it, you're full of shit, and you need to be better than that if I'm paying you this much.
I agree with everything that you're saying. I think the way Bezos did it by going, but apoplectic is not the way to do it.
Yeah.
But I think, and you and I have a similar management style that we would do this. I do little things like this in my business. We had a call center that was terrible, and we did the exact same thing. We did an exercise. We called them and we ultimately hung up on them, but we were on hold. We got moved a bunch of times. It's like, this sucks. We have to fix this. It was handled more the Paul way than the Bezos way. But
Get in the weeds a little. Get in the weeds a little.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I did that on a regular basis. If a salesperson was telling me they're not picking their phone up, I used to love this one. I would just be like, what's the number? And I would just dial it, put it on speaker, 2 rings, customer picks up. Oh, hey, how's it going? Hey, this is Ian Matthews. I'm a manager. Has anyone reached out to you in a while? I want to just check in. Oh, no. And watch the person squirm with a red face right in front of you. And you get out the phone, you're like, don't bullshit me. Just stop. Like, I don't have the patience for it. Can we just be adults and tell each other the truth that you hadn't made a phone call next time?
So Groner,
trust me, when that gets around the office. Don't tell Ian this. He'll call customer.
The opposite side of the story. So Groner was giving me a hard time. I'm like, Beth, I'm calling. I'm telling you, I'm calling. I've called from my cell phone. I've called from the model. She picked up her phone. The person picked up right there. I'm like, I swear to God, I've been calling. They've been screening me.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So another funny one, just a random one, but speaking of crazy managers. So a lot of times with these guys, what makes them genius also would make them crazy to have to work for. Bezos recruited a very talented Apple executive away, and Steve Jobs met with this Apple executive for his exit interview and said, why do you want to go to a boring retailer when Apple's in the process of changing the world, reinventing computing? And in the conversation, it starts with him trying to keep him, and it ends with suggesting that this career move reveals just how stupid this executive is, and then maybe it's a good thing that you're leaving Apple anyway because you're not smart enough to be here with us. And I just found that story hilarious because Steve Jobs it's good to be king.
There's no doubt it's good to be king. It's one of those things that the kingmaker rarely ever has any humility and can see past the end of their nose. And Amazon ended up being every bit as big as Apple. I don't know market cap wise. I think it's pretty darn close. I think Apple's actually bigger still, but I drew similar parallels to this with Sam Walton. And Sam Walton from Walmart was kind of caught flat by Amazon because he had that same, like, they're just an online retailer. They're not going to be able to do what we do. And they didn't innovate. They got arrogant. And because they got arrogant and didn't innovate, these smaller companies won and became huge monsters that were real problems for them going forward.
Warren Buffett called the story of Amazon a miracle, right? Something going from zero to the biggest company in the world. He called it a miracle. And within the company, it's easy from outside to want to emulate that. But within the company, one executive who worked for Jeff a long time, her direct quote was, if you're not good, Jeff will chew you up and spit you out. And if you are good, he will jump on your back and ride you into the ground. That's what it's like working for a CEO in a very fast growing, innovative company. They're not producing those outrageous, first of their kind, innovative results by being nice guys, by being the, spiritual leader. They're usually going to be pretty tough and pretty hard. And Bezos's people, they called his rants nutters. They called him nutters. He's on another nutter. These are just some of the quotes in the book that I had written down that were his favorite they called them Jeffisms, that he would ask people in front of crowds. Did you take your stupid pills today? Should I go get my certificate says I'm CEO so you'll quit challenging me? Why are you taking credit for something you had nothing to do with? Are you lazy or just incompetent? Why are you ruining my life? This document was clearly written by the B team. These are just a few things that they had kind of listed, but Bezos is pretty much a prick to you all the time. This is his management style. I am quite sure in the next 20 years, he's going to work really hard to rewrite his story so that people think he was a soft and loving leader. Jobs has kind of tried to do this too. I see quotes all the time attributed to Steve Jobs that you just know he didn't actually say, because let's be real, Steve Jobs was an insane manager. No one would work for Steve Jobs if you weren't paid a lot of money. So I don't know if you have a take on this, but I think in some of these really, really outrageously good company, there's some insanity at the top to get them to kind of bend reality.
Yeah. What's the quote? The Jobs, there's something about Jobs about the distortion field. It's like the reality distortion field or something like that. Yeah. And what it was is like he would set these ridiculous deadlines and people like, we can't hit it. And they typically didn't hit them, but they were pretty darn close. So I come back to, you articulated it in a way that was better than I would articulate it. But when you're making seismic changes to the world, I think people are more willing to put up with just irrational treatment and behavior. What I take from this is we're not changing the world. We're building houses, we're flipping houses. I treat people differently. I still demand and command a lot of respect, and I demand a high level of commitment and performance. But it's different than a lot of what these people can do in the tech world because of the fact that it's a different mindset. And I think you got to just know where you are in the world. The other thing that I'll bring up with this, Ian, and because it's not in our notes, but it's something that you said. When I was a younger person, I thought that these magnanimous people with statues were binary. Like they were just one. They weren't binary. They were just one thing. They were great leaders. They were great this. But you realize over time, everyone is a human being who's done anything, and they're multifaceted. And even if the narrative is Carnegie Hall, all these things Carnegie did, in order to afford it, they were ruthless. And there's multiple sides of everyone. And history often gets whitewashed with a ton of money and time. You and I, we just went through a presidential cycle. You and I have talked about the best thing presidents can do is just go shut up and stay off the radar. And 6 to 12 years later, they're looked at as incredible leaders.
They all leave with a approval rating of 40. And if they just will shut up for 5 years, it ends up at 70 or 80.
And by the time it gets...
Bush has a high approval rating right now because what's he do? He's quiet. He doesn't get into politics and he goes to VA hospitals and he's a good guy.
That's
and
it.
When he left, his approval rating could not have been lower.
Right.
And now today it's like 60, 70. It's pretty high.
And so I'll balance this out this way. I said it a second ago, but sometimes there's multiple ways you can do this. You can do this the Paul Seville way, which Ian brought up, where you look at a little detail and you hold someone accountable and you make them know that you are absolutely in the business, understand the business, and you won't take crap. If you're losing track of your staff or people aren't giving the level of commitment that you want, sometimes flying off a handle is okay. And it just shows people you're committed, you're passionate, you won't stand for it. What I've learned is it isn't sustainable. We talked about the asshole. Like, I don't think as a boss, I can do that all the time because it doesn't fit me.
You can't play that hand too often.
Right. But every once in a while you can. And I think in the world of tech and startup and Bezos and Jobs and Musk, you can get away with it a little bit more. I think compensation has a lot to do with it. And I think where they're going has a lot to do with it too.
So the two pizza team, this is one of the legends of Amazon. I've found myself quoting it. I hear managers all over companies quoting the two pizza teams. This meeting, we couldn't feed all these people with two pizzas. And Amazon doesn't. What's fascinating is it's a myth. It's actually Bezos read a book and he got all excited, and this is all over the book where he does this. But he came in and he said, we're gonna reorganize to where our teams are all going to be teams of two pizza teams. And he tried to make the whole company into teams that could be fed with two pizzas. So no more than 6 to 10 people.
Or two Ians and Franks.
I was going to say, Frank and I are a two pizza team. So this podcast is a Amazon-y. We don't have a third person.
We are Amazon inspired.
No pizza left for a third co-host. If they
We're
were
not
here.
talking about some crappy little pan pizza.
Frank and I are a large eats. That's what we go with for lunch. So anyway, if you've quoted this, if you've said this is how they do it in Amazon, if you found yourself saying this in a meeting, you're full of shit, because they tried it for a few months and it largely failed. One executive said being a two pizza team, it wasn't liberating. It was just a real pain in the ass. And the vast majority of people flipped the bit on it. So I just find this funny because a lot of these legends come out of companies where it's like, that's a really revolutionary idea. Small teams, everyone can eat two pizzas, no meetings unless you can feed it with two pizzas. And that's bullcrap. Most of Bezos's meetings that he went to were packed with lots of people. They didn't do two pizza teams. So, and Bezos almost never did one-on-ones. He didn't like one-on-ones. He thought they were a waste of time.
So I thought this was dumb. So it's hard for anyone to take me credibly that thinks anything that Amazon does is dumb, but I thought the two pizza thing was dumb. So what I took for this agenda item is I want to list other things that I thought were dumb. And the two that I came up with are this. They use doors as tables. Like, that's not smart or prudent or cost effective. It's just stupid. It is very hard to write on a table.
Like, they did it. Why? Why did they do doors?
They did it supposedly because it was saving money, but they got to a point where they didn't need to do that anymore.
They did it because it was saving money in the beginning.
It was symbolic.
Because they couldn't afford a conference table when they started in Jeff's garage. So they took a door and they put it on a couple of easels, and that was their table. So it's kind of kitschy, right? It's kind of our humble beginnings, but you're right. You're a $1 trillion company.
It's idiotic to try and write on a door. Yeah. The other thing was the guy ultimately got fired, but he came in from the outside. He didn't understand the culture. And this is kind of two separate things all at the same time. He said in front of Bezos that executives should be able to fly business class. And Bezos flipped out and said, that's not how an owner thinks. And ultimately this guy was pushed out. But this is the same guy that had screwed up the telephones. So it's the same person. The story Ian talked about where it took 4 minutes and he said it would take 1 and it didn't.
Yeah.
So I'm 6'2". On a light day, I'm in the 220s. Normally I live in the 230s or even more. I cannot open my laptop and coach. I can't work and coach. I can't get a damn thing done and coach. I don't fly coach. Now I don't fly private, but I almost always fly first class. And the reason is this, like the difference in a coach fare and a first class fare is usually $250 to $300. But most flights between sitting on the tarmac and being in the air and taxiing are 2 to 3 hours. So most of my company does not fly. But the person who flies the most is typically me. When I could afford it, I immediately started paying for first class. And the reason for it is I could actually work. I could open up my laptop. I could actually be productive. And it usually came out to about $100 an hour. So I think it's incredibly prudent to think about some of these rules and some of these things and be like, does this make sense? Or are we just being stubborn to be stubborn? Or are we just doing something for nostalgia's sake? Are we just going out and buying doors and making those into desks when Office Depot has plenty of great desks that basically cost the same amount? So those are the little things you have to look at. And I understand the nostalgia. I understand the nostalgia of the two pizza team. It usually doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, the two pizza team, he did it for a while. They didn't keep doing it. Like they did it and it literally blew up. It was like 1 year of Amazon, but people quote it like it's still done today. It wasn't. It was an idea. It was an idea that was not good. It was an idea that blew up. Another legend of Bezos, and this one isn't so much a legend. Bezos does make this happen. So the concept of the pre-meeting essay. So Bezos hates PowerPoints, which is cool. A lot of companies don't like PowerPoints. But Bezos likes to read a long narrative before he goes into any meeting. He likes to read. So if you call a meeting and he's there, you have to write a narrative about what the meeting is about. And there's a format. Some people write 10, 12 pages. Some write 3 or 4, but he wants that meeting agenda to be written like a story narrative. And he wants it to be in the shape of a mock press release, as if a customer might see it and work backward. And where I see the fallacy in this, so people are either readers, they learn 2 ways. They're either readers or listeners. And people like to communicate more by either talking, the expressives, or they like to write. So Bezos is a reader and he likes that. So he forces his meetings that way because it helps him prepare for the meeting. But what Jeff did is he went and he forced this on the whole company. So if I'm another executive and I'm not a reader, I like to talk things through and I like to see things different ways. That might not be the best way. So for me, it's an example of what works for me, I'm going to force on my whole team. And I largely look at this as just bad management. It works for Jeff because he's the king and he can force it, but people within the company don't like it. And the people that don't like it, if you think about engineers, one engineer said, think about an engineer doing this. A lot of times it's like putting everything into a narrative is like describing a spreadsheet. Like, why are we using all these words when a spreadsheet with one sheet would explain what I'm trying to talk about? And most people felt like the system was rigged towards good writers. So take Frank and I. Frank is a really expressive person. He's great. I mean, you see him on this, he talks with his hands. He needs to kind of talk things out. That's the way you communicate. You're not a writer. I can kind of do a little bit of both, but I prefer to write as well. If you and I were 2 executives in this company, I would have a huge advantage over you. You would end up figuring out how to write the narrative, but what wouldn't be fair to you is it would take you 3-4 times as long to do it as it would me. Whereas, and you could communicate just as good with some preparation and some thought without having to do that process.
So when I read this, I thought of this. I'm never going to work at Amazon. It's just not how I'm wired. I would have understood early, this is not a place I can distinguish myself. The skill sets that they're going to call from me are going to be skills that I don't easily call for myself. And this is going to be arduous and challenging. And I wouldn't have done it because I don't think I can distinguish myself. And that happened to me coming out of college when I picked where to go to work. I saw companies that allowed me to flourish with strengths and places that would have called my weaknesses out. And I didn't need to go there. So I didn't. But what I would pivot to is this, and I agree with everything you just said. What I would pivot to is this. The way to do this properly as a manager and again, it's something rich coming from me with 30 employees versus a guy with 300,000 employees. But what I see is empowering your leadership team to lead the way it makes sense to lead. Allow them to get out of their staffs what they should do well at. I have a diverse business. My accounting department functions and communicates in a way different way than my rental management department. My sales department functions differently. My construction department functions differently.
Yeah.
I don't manage all of them the same. People who are drawn to and do well in these different positions have different skill sets. Construction people, by and large, are not incredible writers. They just aren't. Glassmacher used to always talk about that. Yeah, the verbal's low. Like, that's how it is in people who get into construction. It doesn't mean they're not analytical. It doesn't mean they don't whip around on a spreadsheet or can anticipate a problem and get ahead of it. It's just they're not expressive that way. So I think what you have to look at is there's probably some good in this, but Bezos was really, really, really reliant upon home court advantage. And his home court advantage set it up so he could always be ahead. But they might have gotten further faster if someone had led in a way that allowed other people to flourish besides him. Now, I will say this: it covers it in this book to some degree, but it covers it like the internet and news stories covered very well. And this really applies to Zuckerberg a lot. I think that these really smart, they started as kids, men, started off as people who did not know how to lead or manage, but they learned how to lead or manage. And some of these things, the Jeffisms, the two pizza teams, they were ideas that were pushed aside because better managers showed up and said, this really doesn't work for this reason. The essay needs to be scrapped because you're preventing an engineer from expressing how important something is. And we don't need him to write an essay. We need him to design this.
It's like Google marketing themselves that we don't have hierarchy here. No one reports to anyone. You talk to anyone who works at Google, they'll be like, that's such bullshit. I mean, just because there's no org chart, we all had bosses. We all had people to report to. Like, it was cute when it was Serge and Bryn starting and they're like, no managers, we're millennials running this shit. And it's like, well, that's not exactly how the company runs when you talk to people in it.
I feel as if we've gone way too far without a pop culture reference, so I'm going to use one here. So I love Quentin Tarantino movies, just love them. The first one I ever saw was Pulp Fiction, but I've seen them all now. But he did Inglourious Bastards, and Brad Pitt is playing a role, and he's working up against someone else, and he's like, this guy doesn't say very much. This guy, he's not very talkative. He's not exactly the loquacious type. And Brad Pitt looks at him and goes, that's what this job calls for, huh? The loquacious type. And the guy, Brad Pitt, makes it through the movie in World War II and doesn't get killed. And the guy who was asking for the loquacious type, who was not happy with this other guy and the way he communicated, gets killed. And to me, like, that's the perfect example here. Like, know what the job needs and have that. They were out killing people because it was war, and he didn't need someone who was talkative. He needed someone who was really good at killing people. And that was like the whole part of that scene, which I just loved.
That's hilarious. So I'm curious of your take. Bezos, at some point, once they became Amazon, once they became big, he promoted someone into a chief of staff role. And they called it, within the company, they called it the official shadow, Bezos shadow. 21 on the agenda here, Frank. So the shadow's job was just to follow Jeff around. Everywhere Jeff went, the shadow went. They weren't a personal assistant. It wasn't that. It was someone who had actual authority in the company. It was someone that usually Jeff was grooming to put onto the S team to figure something out. And I thought this, especially for a larger company, I thought this was a fascinating role, and one that, when you get high up in a company, it can be lonely. There's no one to turn to. There's no one, you got all these thoughts and you can't complain down all the time. But I could see that being a really cool role as a company grows, for an owner to just have a chief of staff, someone that just helps them stay organized, stay focused on big initiatives, big picture, and to kind of know everything that the owner and CEO is involved in.
It's I like the position. Do you remember what happened? Does he still have this role now, or was this just a
Still
period?
has it. Yeah, he's had multiple shadows after. It was like it's like a 1 to 2 year stint that you play in there.
So the way that I read it is my business isn't so lucrative that I can afford a shadow.
Of course.
And the way that I look at it is this. I love doing parts of my business with others in the room. Like, I don't like doing email alone. I don't like to just type and go through and do that. I like to talk about it and to collaborate while we're doing it. Like, I will whittle everything down, or I have an assistant who whittles everything down. And then I have like bullet points that I go over with people. And for me, I am capable of replying to an email alone, but I don't do it that way because, like, Carla will send me 10, 15 emails in the course of the week. I pull out 5 bullet points and we'll go over 3 or 4 emails together on a Zoom call or in a conference room. And the reason for that is it turns into conversation points about why she sent me this, what's going on, what's the reason behind the reason. So we're still small enough where I don't have a shadow, but I've got 5 or 6 people who I like to work with in a very similar capacity to this. Angelo and I, for a couple of years, would get together on the weekends and sit down and just go through items and work on them. So I love the fact that they've been able to do this with some level of success. I would love to have someone in my business that could do this, but it's not a position that I have seen that I can replicate one off, but I do feel like it's something that we do kind of departmentally and kind of piece by piece.
I think that's right. I think for me, I think about the highest level position I've been in where I had regional managers reporting to me. I sort of had 2 or 3 that I leaned on more than most, that I would just call about everything. And I probably was in that role, if you think about it, in my last role, because the job I was doing and my boss's job were kind of the same. We were both kind of responsible for everything. So the 2 of us talked about everything and went a lot of the same meetings, did a lot of the same things together. So I think I found it interesting. I do think when you have a high level position, it helps very much to have some insiders very close to you that know all of your thoughts, like both the positive, the exciting ones, but also the I'm worried about these things.
So I want to say 2 things on this when we move on. It's hard to have one person who understands everything that a business owner can understand and do. And think about that. Like, if this person starts off and moves their way up and kind of goes up the ladder and has been in 6 or 8 positions and then becomes your number 2 or your shadow, that's going to have a lot more value than having someone from the outside who kind of checks emails or does things, because this is not an easy thing to understand. Like, I've had someone ask me, like, you have ADD? And I'm like, no, I don't have ADD. I just got 8 different businesses.
You got a lot in your head.
Yeah, I have 8 different businesses. My phone's constantly going off. I mean, I've been interrupted like 6 times during this podcast, and everybody knows not to come in because, clearly the world's burning down around me. And that's just kind of how it goes. But I'll use an example that I think is actually kind of neat. A name I know I don't know if you know him, but his name is Ed Dean. Ed Dean is a mortgage broker in Northern Virginia. And he's been at it a long time. 2 decades ago, when I was building my first house, I sat across from Ed Dean and talked to him. And ultimately, he did a few loans for me. But what I found very fascinating about Ed Dean was he was a loan officer, but he produced at the level of someone who was a regional, even though he was a loan officer. And his processors were all compensated like loan officers. So I'm using late 90s, early 2000s, and he had people around him who were processors that were making 150 grand, which was a fortune. But what he was basically doing is, although he was simply a loan officer generating loans, he had 4 or 5 people under him who were supposedly processors, but were really loan officers.
They were beasts.
And what I learned from Ed Dean was this: if you pay for incredible talent. Doesn't matter what title they're in. If they can handle their business, you can do more business. And what I've learned is I don't have a shadow. I've got 5 or 6 people in my business who run their business. And I can call them up, talk to them, bend their ear, if it's personal stuff or feel stuff. But I have 5 or 6 people I rely on in my business because I have 5 or 6 different silos of business, and it requires that. So that to me is the lesson that I learned, is put really smart, articulate people in these roles that you can trust, and then go talk to them and understand, see what's going on.
From being close enough to you to know your business, you don't have a true number 2. You have 4 number 2s, 4 or 5 number 2s, and they're all responsible, and you lean on them all equally. They're not any more important or less. And I felt the same way in senior level executive roles. I always had 4 or 5 people that I just were go-tos for certain things. And I found myself talking to them 80% of the time. And they knew how I thought, they knew what I was thinking. I was very comfortable with them. I could be very direct and blunt with them, and they could be direct and blunt with me. And that made me more effective, having those kind of people.
There's another side of the scene that I think is important to talk about. If you only have one number 2, you only have one other opinion. But by me having the multiple silos that I talked about, they all have different pressures, and they all have different metrics, and they all have slightly different
backgrounds, right?
Yeah.
Different thought process on risk and what type of risk to take. And it's helpful. It's a diversity of thought that you're using on as your counsel.
It's the exact opposite of show up with an essay that I can read.
Yes.
Instead of having an essay that everyone has to write, so I get to read it and manage it one way, I've got a diverse set of inputs that allow me to see things different ways because of the people in the jobs doing great work and being smart and educated about what it is that they do.
I'm going to jump down in the agenda to Ted Jorgensen. So I know you didn't underline anything, but Ted Jorgensen is Jeff Bezos' biological father. And the author of this book found Bezos' biological father working in a bike shop. So he'd already interviewed Bezos multiple times. He'd been working with the Amazon group forever. And this guy almost never got brought up, right? This was the unicycler who left at a very young age, and was never in Jeff's life from the time Jeff was like 5. He didn't even remember his dad.
In a slightly different and cruder way, he was basically a sperm donor. Like he was a living, but everything that happened in Bezos's life goes back to his mom and his stepdad.
So the author goes and finds this guy in his bike shop, this tiny little bike shop, and says, what do you think about your son's great success? I'm writing a book on him and his amazing company. He's a billionaire. And the guy says, who? And he said, well, Jeff Bezos. And because he had changed his name. So Jorgensen didn't know it was Bezos. He had forgotten already his name. And the quote is, he was utterly confused and denied being the father of the most famous CEO and one of the wealthiest men in the world. And he pulled out a picture, said, this is what he looks like today. And Jorgensen recognized him because he was his father for 5 years, at least he was around. And he said, is he still alive? And then he got moved. He was emotional about it. And we talked earlier about regrets and the regret minimization framework. And when I read this page of the book, I just found it so incredibly sad. Because I don't have Jeff Bezos aspirations. I don't really care to run a company as big as Amazon. I don't want to be worth $200 billion. I don't know what I would do with all of that. But when I heard about this and I thought about it, for me, there's nothing I ever wanted to be more than being a dad. There's nothing I ever wanted more than that. That's my ambition, has always been that. I've been pretty good at business and I do it. And I do it because I want to make a lot of money so I can be a dad more. But the last few years for me, as busy as I keep, everything I do in business, and this, Frank, because it's hard to get me after 3:30 on a weekday. Everything is secondary to being a dad. Everything. This morning at 6:15, I was at Diamond Heroes with my son for an hour and a half. We were playing baseball before school. And if you think that's crazy that my 10-year-old gets up at 6:15 sometimes because that's the only time we could do it, he loves it. And I love it. We got the whole facility to ourselves. I hit him some grounders. We play catch. We hit baseballs. And if there was anything I would regret in life, it would be that I kept pushing my way up the chain and didn't have that time. Didn't have that time to coach, to be around, to just goof with my kids all the time. So, this page kind of wrapped everything up to me. Is you can have all the ambition in the world, and when you go to that deathbed conversation you were having earlier of something you would regret, what are those flashbulb moments? All the stuff we talk about in this podcast of, the meetings I've had with CEOs or raising money, all that shit. I don't know. I don't think I'm going to care about any of that on my deathbed. I'm going to remember coaching baseball. That's what I'm going to remember. That's all I'm going to remember. Is like the moments with my kids. That's all my dad and mom talk about is me when I was a kid and how much fun we had and the trips we went on and you playing hockey. And I think that's all you really kind of remember as you get older is family.
So I'm going to take this in two separate directions. The thing about my business that I'm the most proud of is the people and the impact we have on the community. One of the initiatives we put in place this year, we're going to plant 300 trees in neighborhoods that have trees taken out of them, and it really makes a difference. There was an article in the New York Times last year that came out, and it talked about how the poorer neighborhoods have no trees, and people die in the summers because they don't have air conditioning, and these people just literally heat stroke, they die. And it's one of Richmond was redlined. It was a very racist city. It was redlined 100 years ago, and this is real. So one of the things that we're going to do this year as a company is we're going to plant trees. Another thing we're going to do as a company is we're going to do 1,000 hours of community service. Our 401k is unofficially tied to it, and we have a little measuring stick in our front foyer, and we're going to literally do 1,000 hours of community service as a company. That's one of our missions for 2021.
Love that. That's cool.
So, well, why do I bring those two things up? It's not an ego trip. It's because those are the things that matter the most. It's the people. It's what you do. We all make a lot of money. We all are in America. We all have great lives. Like compared to, if you go to a third world country, the things we take for granted, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But what I can tell you is this: the things that I'm most proud of are the people, what we do, how we do it, and the impact. That's what I'm the most excited about. I'm excited about providing affordable housing. I hope my personal life trumps my business life and my flashbulb moment memories right before I die. And I'm working hard every single day. I'm a new dad to do that. But at the business side, I'm thrilled with what we do on the business side. The other thing I want to talk about is this, and it kind of dovetails, and I'll keep it clean and tight so it doesn't take too much time. If you read Steve Jobs' biography, Steve Jobs had a sister. He found his sister. He had a biological sister, and the sister had found their dad. And they were adopted by different people, Steve Jobs and his biological sister, so they had different names. So Steve Jobs asked his sister, "Don't tell him who I am. You can do whatever you want. I don't need him to know who I am." And it just so happened that Steve Jobs' biological dad was still in Silicon Valley, and he owned a restaurant. He owned an ethnic restaurant that Steve Jobs would go to. And Steve Jobs' biological father would brag to people that Steve Jobs ate in his restaurant. He had all this pride wrapped around the fact that his food was eaten by the great Steve Jobs, missing the fact that this was actually his son.
Yeah.
And it just missed it. So what I want to talk about are these two things. For people who achieve at this level, almost all of them have had tragedy or something, some hole they needed to fill. And I'm curious of what the driver is. The book doesn't go into it with Bezos and like, was there something missing or what was it? But with Steve Jobs' case, there was always something he was chasing. The other side of it is this. There's 100 country songs written about this. Brad Paisley wrote a song. I pulled it up so I could quote it properly. The name of the song is He Didn't Have to Be. And it's all about a stepdad and how that stepdad impacted this little kid. He goes, I hope I'm half the man that he didn't have to be. Meaning that when he's a kid or he's a father, which he is, can he be half as good as this man who didn't have to be his dad? And what I look at with Bezos is he hit the freaking lottery. He ended up with this dad that raised him like he was his own. And it's so sad that his real dad didn't know who he was. But think of that incredible man that became his stepdad, that adopted him, that treated him like his own, that backed him, that supported him. And you can't control the other guy who essentially was the sperm donor. But for Bezos's namesake dad, wow.
And it's, what Bezos did and created that company, that's nearly impossible. It's first ever, and who knows if it'll happen again. But, for his dad, who was never around, look, it's hard being a good dad. It's hard. It's, you got to put in a bunch of work, but it's not that hard. Billions of people do it. I talk to you about this all the time, Frank, like being a mom and dad. Okay, billions of people on the planet figure it out every day. But being a great one, being really memorable, being there all the time, being present when you're around them, that's difficult. That's difficult to give. And that's how you'll be remembered. For me, I'm very blessed in that I'm in a place in my life where my kids are in that sweet spot where they want to be around me all the time. And I got the time to do it. And I'm very focused. You and I talk about it a lot, of building businesses that let me keep putting them number one right now. Cause that's just where I'm at right now in this world. And I coach you on this all the time. Build a business that lets you coach T-ball. Don't build one that you're going to be able to say, I got to pass on coaching T-ball, because you will regret if you don't coach your kid in sports. You'll regret it. You'll regret not being around for it.
My son is, a little over 2. And I had to go away for business earlier this week. And my wife was asking me this morning, it's Friday as we're recording this. She asked me, she knows, like, what are our weekend plans? And I'm like, I'm taking Max Saturday morning. And she's like, oh, you are? I'm like, yeah, I didn't see him for a few days. He had a traumatic event. He fell and he lost a tooth this week. And it's like, I just want to go be with him. I just want to go spend time with him. And this isn't Ian and me preaching to you out there about how you should be a parent and be a dad. But what we talk about a lot, we don't typically record this and talk about it as a podcast. We talk about enjoyment of our families. It's big to both of us. It's something that's at the core of who we are. Ian's biggest regret that he still talks about 16 years later is not being with his parents on weekends and having the meals at the house. Like, this is the fabric of who we are. So what I would say in this and how I live, I tell my son something every night when I tuck him in. And I tell him, son, these are the good old days. And I give him a kiss and I put him in his bed and I pat him and I ask him for a high five. And he says, bye, Dada. And I walk out of the room. And what's really cool is, he was referenced earlier, Nickel was telling me a story about what he told his daughter. And he's like, Frank, she's my goddaughter, tells Max that these are the good old days. And he had to explain to his daughter what that meant. She's only 16. She didn't get it. And he goes, well, you're learning to get your learner's permit and get your license. When you're 21, you're going to have different worries. And we're going to think, man, wasn't life simple when I was trying to get my driver's license? I think one of the things that Ian, that's at the core of why we do this, this is a way for Ian and I to have fun and kind of cement things and memories that we do and memorialize them and talk about them together. Like, Ian and I are very good friends. This makes us closer. We have an hour a week where we're talking about a similar subject. And then when we're not recording, we talk about things that we want to talk about or things that we just talked about. And what I can tell you is this: I hope to be successful in business. But if I had to pick becoming a business success or a family success, I mean, I had to pick it in harsher terms, be a business failure. but be a successful husband and father, I would choose those.
Yeah, if you got to look at the two, or be a failure as a father and a husband, that's the right decision to make. You've got to prioritize and kind of figure things out. So I think it's kind of a somber way to finish this. I think I can speak for myself. I just don't have Jeff Bezos' ambition. As I read through the book, probably about 100 pages into a 300-page book, he had blown past my ambitions of where I was at that point in my life, and I'm cool with it. The older I get, I still have plenty of different ambitions and things I want to do as long as they're fun. It's a phenomenal story. There's a lot of urban legends that it helped me break up about what it's like to work within that company and the things that they do. And it's also a matter of Amazon. People adore it. Customers adore it. Not everyone who works there loves working there. They bully a lot of suppliers and some people, but to make customers love you for that long and to do things as well at low prices with that speed, you have to have a very heavy hand to pull off what they did. That's my biggest takeaway.
So you type this, but I feel the same way, and I'm going to just kind of say it because we said it earlier. Ian and I went to Omaha, Nebraska, where all good times are hatched. And we went to the annual meeting before COVID when for Berkshire Hathaway. And we've talked about it before. We don't need to get too deep into it now. But someone asked Buffett and Munger, like, why didn't you invest in Amazon? And Buffett said, hey, what he did is incredible. Congratulations. We're huge fans. And Ian said this earlier, we don't invest in miracles. And what I can tell you is this, and I feel this way. In order to create a miracle, there's an insane sacrifice. There's a lot of happiness between the ground and a miracle around life. We read books like this because they inspire us and they're fun and they're cool. And it's really neat to get inside the brain of someone like that. I will most likely never be a billionaire, and I'm perfectly fine with that. There's a lot of good living between here and there. And one of the things that I learned from Ian, and I've talked about it before, but I'll say it again, is just really enjoying the moment. And I for us, this podcast is us enjoying the moment. We have fun, we laugh, we joke, we have a good time, we talk about stuff we like. But if you have that insane desire to build something and it's enjoyable for you, do it. But if you're on a different trajectory, and most likely if you're listening to this podcast, you are, what I would tell you is this: enjoy what it is that you've chosen to do and have a great time doing it. And pay attention to the important stuff. Do the things that are in a way that impact you a way that you want them to, and have fun with it. And it's kind of it.
Frank, that's a hell of a wrap up. I don't have much to add to it. It's been a pleasure talking to you for 3 hours about the Everything Store.
Again, we should have just done an audiobook.
I bet the audiobook is like 5. It's probably like 5 hours to hear the whole book.
I'll tell you this, we're an hour late finishing when we wanted to, so I'm going to say it now like I said in the beginning. Ian, you son of a bitch!
See you, Frankie. That wraps up our 2-part compelling series on the Everything Store. We hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as we enjoyed reading the book, taking notes, building an outline, and spending 3 hours talking about Jeff Bezos taking over the world. If you love our show, please give us a review at Apple Podcasts. If you're new to the show, we'd love it if you hit that subscribe button.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.